So as we wait for people to come in here, I thought I'd kind of talk a little bit about who put this all together and who me and Michael are, and I'll give an introduction for Tyler a bit later once we officially get started. So my name is Cole Silva.
And I'm Michael Harris.
And we're the co-chairs of Cape Cod DSA. And so we're the Cape Cod local chapter of the largest socialist organization in the country, the Democratic Socialists of America. Our mission is to educate ourselves and those around us on the inherently destructive nature of capitalism and look to socialism as an alternative, while also pushing for transformational changes from the local level and all the way up to the federal level. So some popular democratic socialists that you may be familiar with are Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Albert Einstein, and Martin Luther King Jr. And so while the organization as a whole focuses on many different issues, each chapter can choose based on their membership what they would like to work on. So for Cape Cod DSA, we have 3 different foci right now. We're collaborating with other DSA chapters across the state on a ballot initiative to achieve Medicare for all in Massachusetts, in addition to pushing for a green stimulus, which is similar to like the Green New Deal. And at the Cape level, we're currently investigating how we can alleviate the housing situation, particularly the lack of year-round rentals and the sky-high prices of the few rentals that do exist. At the moment, we're looking into the possibility of constructing social housing on Cape and what that would entail. And so once we kind of get that research together, we'll be moving forward with how to best tackle that. But we also have bi-weekly general meetings. We have weekly night schools on Friday nights where we talk about different topics, read different articles, watch different clips, and then have a lively political discussion. And yeah, Michael, do you want to say a bit about what the rest of the speaker series is going to look like, maybe?
Yeah, so we actually have a very good lineup. Sorry, I wasn't quite prepared for Cole to ask me
I mean,
that.
you don't have to go into full detail, just like why we put this together in general.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So obviously in light of the George Floyd murder, we thought it was necessary to, kind of give a more theoretical broad understanding of policing and society. Of course, the thing that's talked about a lot is the racial aspect of policing in America, which is obviously incredibly important. But policing, just as a power of the state and its more broad effects across different communities, is something that sometimes gets not as much light. And so our goal with this kind of speaker series is to give like a good theoretical foundation and historical foundation for policing, and to also bring in some of these other communities that also experience the threat of state violence.
Great, thanks, Michael. So with that, we're at about 5 past the hour, and I think we're going to kick things off. So thank you, everybody, for coming. For those of you that just hopped on, my name is Cole Silva, and this is Michael Harris, and we are the co-chairs of Cape Cod DSA who organized this event. So just to kind of give you an idea of what this event is going to look like for the rest of the night, we've had a slight change in format. So after I kind of finish babbling and introduce our speaker, then our speaker Tyler will talk for 15 to 20 minutes, and then he'll transition into like an interview style dialogue between Michael, where they'll ask a few different questions and kind of talk back and forth. And then around 8 o'clock, we're gonna open up the chat. You can't access it right now because we're trying to avoid any distractions during the talk, but we're gonna open up the chat at the end of this, and you can put in any questions that you may have for Tyler that you would like to see him answer. So what we would advise you to do is during the talk, if you think of any questions, please write them down. And then once we come to the top of the hour at 8, you can put those in the chat once the chat is activated. Additionally, any hateful or inappropriate behavior will result in an immediate ban from the event with no opportunity for re-entry. So please keep it civil and be nice. So, all right, our speaker today, we are honored to have Tyler Wall, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He writes on the political and cultural economies of racialized state violence and security politics, with a specific focus on radical theories of police power and war power under regimes of racial capitalist order. He has contributed work in a wide assortment of media, including but not limited to academic journals like Antipode, Radical Philosophy, Theoretical Criminology, and Socialist Studies, Études Socialistes. He has edited books such as Social Justice and the Sociological Imagination, and Police is Waging a Secret War on the Nature of Cops and Capitalism. He has also contributed chapters to books like The Geography of Environmental Crime, Towards a Victimology of State Crime, and Schools Under Surveillance, Cultures of Control in Public Education. His co-authored book, Police: A Field Guide, was published by Verso Books in March of 2019, and his co-edited book with David Correa, The Nature of Police, is forthcoming from Haymarket Books. Currently, Tyler is writing a book manuscript that takes the police dog as a diagnostic of the racialized dynamics of police, violence, animality, property, and capitalist civilization. Please welcome Tyler Wall. Thank you so much for being here, Tyler.
Okay, thanks for having me. So I want to thank Cole and Michael for inviting me to speak tonight. This speaker series on police and society and, struggles and growing demands around defunding the police and police abolition. And I want to say I hope you all tune in next week at the same time, I believe, for Luis Fernandez's talk, which I know will be fabulous and a great conversation. He's a great thinker and scholar. I prefer much to watch and listen to others on the screen than knowing others are watching and listening to me. So I kind of struggled in how to put together my brief comments. But I'm gonna do my best here. So we'll try to make this as painful or painless as possible for everyone. But so let me jump in. Rachel Herzing, the great abolitionist organizer and co-founder of Critical Resistance and current co-director of the Center for Political Education, recently wrote a wonderful piece that I would encourage everyone to read. The title was Political Education in a Time of Rebellion. And Rachel makes the case that, and I quote, struggle and study are inextricably linked and feed off each other. It's always the right time for political education. And then she goes on to define political education as, quote, the practice of studying the history and analysis of struggles for social, political, geographic, and economic power with the explicit purpose of strengthening political organizations and movements for social change. Rachel encourages us to never stop learning and asking questions, and she says this must include what she says is not falling for the myth that study is the enemy of action while working hard to avoid false distinctions between thinkers and doers. And I felt this was, I kept thinking of this as I was prepping my talk. So in this spirit, my task, I guess, this evening is to begin the speaker series with some reflections on a seemingly simple question. What is police? Of course, what often appears to be a simple question proves to be more complex and multi-layered once we try to answer it. And I'm not going to be able to, answer all that multi-layered complexity in this hour and a half. But in my view, thinking rigorously about what is police provides us not only some important historical lessons, but also clues to why police reform, as it has been practiced from essentially the beginning of modern police, has been not only an utter failure, but a key mode of actually normalizing and further entrenching routine police violence. It is a rather basic point to say that any radical left movement seeking to challenge the status quo will have to confront the police on multiple levels, in the streets, in our communities, in our workplaces, on our campuses, and everywhere else there is a police presence. Because the very presence of police is always a violent presence, and especially in the lives of the poor and poor Black, brown, and indigenous people. This also entails an inevitable confrontation with the cop in our head, or the ways we all too often see the world through the eyes of a cop. So in Police: A Field Guide, the co-authored book with David Correa, published by Verso, we make an argument about what we call cop speak, or how so much of what we know about the police comes to us from a language given to us by police, which is also to say the state, capital, and histories of colonialism. I would suggest that police is so synonymous with dominant conceptions of order and civilization that the idea of thinking about police abolition is quite difficult for many people. In some sense, there's a widespread belief that police is a prerequisite condition for life itself. And I think this is the basic claim of the popular thin blue line mythology we've all seen on bumper stickers and t-shirts or flags. And this underlines the reactionary rallying cry of Blue Lives Matter. Indeed, at one point in Europe, police was actually synonymous with the word civilization, meaning police and civilization were essentially interchangeable terms. This was because the word police didn't simply mean what we think of today as the police, or the uniformed agents that Lenin once called, quote, a professional cast of men trained in the practice of violence upon the poor, men who receive somewhat higher pay and the privileges that go with authority, to say nothing of gratuities, end quote. Instead, police and the police power meant broad social policy that was tasked with identifying and intervening in various threats to social order, to which crime was but one of many. Eventually, though, as my good friend Mark Nicholas points out, this more capacious understanding of police came to be narrowed down into what we think of as the police, as crime fighters and law enforcement. But as he shows, police still retain its mandate of fabricating good order, which is also to say that the primary focus of is not crime or even law, but capitalist order itself. It is why still to this day, many people associate police with the idea and demand for order, as crime becomes not just a sign of crime, but a larger disorder threatening to devour the civilization of private property itself. This is also why I think the current legitimacy crisis of US policing is so fascinating in so many ways, even as the idea of a cop and right-wing backlash are quite real and very scary. More and more people now are questioning the role of police in maintaining a capitalist status quo of racism, austerity, and mass poverty and premature death. And this clearly has, connections with the pandemic, of course. But this has raised questions about reform, defunding, and abolition. And I'm not going to go into great detail on what abolition is or is not, or defunding for that matter. There are tons of people much more equipped to answer that question. And many of those will be on the future speaker series, speakers in this series. But I am more than happy to answer some questions or at least engage in some dialogue on these things in the Q&A. What I do want to keep talking about for a bit is this question about how we might understand police in relation to the question of reform. In my view, police is a very specific type of political power that was never meant to be held accountable to the rule of law or other oversight measures. It is why I call police a prerogative power or an executive power that of course belongs to the larger system of law, but at the same time it exceeds any significant legal restraints on the police power. In his masterful 1966 essay, A Report from Occupied Territory, the famed writer James Baldwin gets at this when he speaks of the, quote, arrogant autonomy of police, a phrase that I think strikingly captures the idea of police prerogative. It is in this same essay that Baldwin defined police as the hired enemies of the Black population. And he goes on, quote, they are present to keep the Negro in his place and to protect white business interests, and they have no other function. They are, moreover, quite stunningly ignorant. And since they know that they are hated, they are always afraid. One cannot possibly arrive at a more surefire formula for cruelty. And I think this has proved prophetic for our current times. As a special apparatus of the state possessing this arrogant autonomy to protect the abstract order of private property, which is always gendered and racialized, police are defined by two basic structural qualities: violence and discretion. Violence is the means they use, and by violence here, I don't just mean directly physical harm, but also coercion or the threat of violence licensed by the law. The legal capacity to use violence separates police from all other institutions, since police are legally sanctioned to exercise violence against virtually anyone who is not ostensibly a police officer. But we need to be clear here. Violence is not just the right of police work. Violence is a condition of police work. The work of police, therefore, is the work of legal violence. Cops are violence workers first and foremost. And there's a great book, we use that in our term violence workers, but there's a great book by Nicole Siegel called Violence workers that is really good. One of the most influential sociologists of police to make this point, Egon Bittner, argued that, quote, the role of the police is best understood as a mechanism for the distribution of non-negotiable coercive force employed in accordance with the dictates of an intuitive grasp of situational exigencies, end quote. Bitter argued that the authority of police to use force is nearly without restriction, particularly because the use of force comes with no real consequences. The idea of lawful violence then is kind of meaningless, as police violence stands forever outside of legal sanction. We can see this in the fact that cops rarely ever get charged or prosecuted. Coercive force structures all police practice then. We call police because of their capacity to deploy violence if necessary. Even when an arrest appears to take place with no visible resistance, this encounter is in no way absent of violence, but completely structured by it. As the legal theorist Robert Cover famously noted, quote, we don't talk our prisoners to jail, end quote. It only appears that the defendant goes along willingly. Violence is always there and ready to make itself known. So the arrogant autonomy of police is directly linked to their capacity for violence, but also discretion, which is key to understanding the police power as an executive power and cops as what some call petty sovereigns, or the phrase I like is everyday executives. In the most basic definition, discretion is the legal authority extended to police to decide what should be done in a particular situation. It refers to the police powers in general, where to patrol, when to use force, who to arrest, who to kill or let live. Contrary to liberal thought that sees police in liberal democracies as accountable to law, police power is never meant to be restricted by law, and it is the category of discretion that makes this apparent. Rather, police power is the routine application of what John Locke called the prerogative, or the executive power of the sovereign to be free from legal restraints. This is based on the sovereign claim as the sole authority regarding what constitutes an emergency and threat to, quote, the public good. Cops have nearly unlimited discretionary power to decide who or what is a threat or emergency and what is the most appropriate or necessary method of response. Indeed, courts have consistently refused to define police discretion, since to define discretion would be to limit the power of police, as legal scholar Marcus Dubber has pointed out. And I really think this is important. They refuse to define discretion because to define it would be to limit it. Moreover, part of this reasoning is premised on the idea that there cannot be predetermined universal codes for handling police situations, and therefore police are granted nearly unlimited discretion to best handle an incident however they see fit. So let me kind of cut to the chase. The police institution cannot be reformed in a way that actually uplifts the lives of the poor and the Black, brown, and indigenous folk who we know are disproportionately affected by police. The arrogant autonomy of police always resists any substantial limit to their powers to act however police see fit. If there's anything we should learn from the history of police in the United States, is that abolition isn't near the crazy idea many might think. So in my police and society class that I teach regularly, I talk to students about what I have somewhat tongue-in-cheek called the 5-second history of police. And here it is: corruption, controversy, reform, repeat. Corruption, controversy, reform, repeat. Perhaps it's too simple, but I think it grasps the general historical cycles of police violence and police reform as it's played out in the United States and really Europe. Ever since modern policing was created, there came corruption, violence, ineffectiveness, brutality, which always led to controversies and protests and riots, and lack of legitimacy, crises of legitimacy. In response, reforms were made, such as more education and training and technology, often due to the pressure of social movements, of course. And yet here we are today in the current moment. And in fact, police history suggests that in reality, the pie in the sky approach to handling crisis and controversies in policing is to think we can actually change policing in any substantial or meaningful way with the typical reforms that have long been trotted out by police officials and both liberal and conservative reformers. We're always hearing more training, more education, better technology, more better trained and educated and more diverse officers with more and more resources, better laws and policies to ensure accountability and oversight, more ways to build trust and faith in police from the very populations most targeted and abused by police, such as officer-friendly campaigns. Well, guess what? These have long been the reform solutions to police crisis, even as they take the shape of the specific time period. Today, it is body cameras, diversity hires and training, implicit bias training, community neighborhood policing, and the Civilian Review Board. And truth be told, many of these have been a staple since the 1960s and 70s. And yet, look where we are. And yet, look at how these solutions are still being trotted out today. And I think maybe something we could talk about in terms of the current moment. The difference today is that more and more people are seeing behind or beyond what my comrade David Correa calls the Trojan horse of police reform, that merely fills in the same old violence, but in different clothes and uniforms and technologies. So I want to end my talk by kind of reading selections from the chapter or entry of the Police Field Guide book on reform. The organizing principle of police reform is the idea that the institution of police is perfectible. This notion of perfectibility depicts police as absolutely essential and always on a path of improvement tomorrow. Perfectibility includes concepts such as accountability, police oversight, and professionalization. These are police reform's key terms, but they are not terms that call the police institution into question. To hold police accountable is to assume that police as an institution is necessary and required in the first place. Likewise, police oversight refuses to examine the police outside a justified or unjustified binary. The problem is not the police, but a public that requires a better understanding of the police project. This is what we're told. Police reform then is mostly about reforming the public's view of the legitimacy of police. And I would just add, it's about not letting us understand the arrogant autonomy of policing, the way in which police is kind of above an outside law at the same time that it's in it. Reformists want us to know that we may see the problem as inhering in police, but in reality, the problem is with us, with our loss of faith. The public misunderstands police and thus misunderstands the problem. The problem is not police violence, which is systemic and institutional, but rather police brutality, which is temporary and individual. The problem is not police in general, but a few bad apples. The problem is not institutional, in other words, but situational. Reform, as the primary driver of this eternal pursuit of improvement, is always calibrated to restore our faith in police by reminding us of their essential goodness and the very temporariness of any problem. New professionalization standards are proposed and described at coffee with a cop meetings around town. New use of force policies are written in consultation with police experts and paid consultants, and then presented at community police forums to great fanfare. Existing police oversight mechanisms are overhauled and premiered at ribbon-cutting ceremonies held with community stakeholders. All of this heralds, we're told, a new era in police community relations. Reformists always claim that the reform measures herald a new era for reform. Reform will demarcate some break from the violence of the past. This is partly why police historians love to talk about police eras through the lens, the effect of which is an ideological rescue of present police from past sins. The politics of police reform are animated by a particular vision of police history. The structure is familiar. In the past, the police were certainly corrupt and violent and racist, but eventually reformists arrived and instituted all sorts of professionalization standards, such as better technology and training and education. And these standards effectively solved the problem, so we're told. Reformed police thus belong to a different era in policing. This history seeks to interrupt efforts by activists to draw a line from the racialized and sexualized police violence of the past to the racialized and sexualized police violence of the present. But the reforms of one era become the problems of another. And reform is always followed by a new crisis. And each time new problems arise, which of course are really just old problems. A cop is caught perjuring himself, for example, or a cop shoots an unarmed man in the back, or an entire department engages in racialized policing or violence against women. When this happens, the agents and institutions of reform mobilize again as though for the first time and with concerted collective amnesia. They diagnose the problem as an unfortunate, temporary, and totally unexpected diversion from the path of police perfectibility. It is the diversion and our persistent lack of faith, not the beating or the lying or the killing, that represents the real intractable problem. Thus, all problems are always temporary aberrations from the righteous path of policing, and only reform experts, many of whom are former cops, can truly understand and repair this problem. And for all these reasons, reform always fails. Cops kill and lie and rape, even officer friendly. I would just point out, most killings by police are not taking place, or are not happening by SWAT officers and military assault rifles. That does happen, but most of the killings and beatings are taking place by the regular patrol officer. So the failure of reform to make police perfect is always depicted as a failure of the public to believe in police, not a failure of reform itself. This constitutes police reform's built-in alibi. Or we could end by quoting Lenin: "The police everywhere, in every republic, however democratic, where the bourgeoisie is in power, always remains the unfailing weapon, the chief support and protection of the bourgeoisie. No important radical reforms in favor of the working masses can be implemented through the police. That is objectively impossible," end quote. And I would suggest, what I'm trying to suggest is that one reason for this is, of course, police's built-in relationship with capitalist property relations, but also what part of that is this arrogant autonomy and the relationship between law and the state, where this idea that policing is a prerogative power that was never meant in the first place to be the same as law and therefore accountable to law. The police is kind of the very specific type of political power that is able to get things done without having to wait on the slow process of law. So anyway, that's it. Thank you. Those are some opening comments. Hopefully we can engage some of these ideas in the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you. I found that whole speech fascinating. And, that's one reason we invited you, just because I think that when I've heard you speak in videos, that you kind of open up new ways of thinking about these things that I haven't heard before. So I'm going to kind of start off my first question with that, because you mentioned a couple times that the police are outside of legal constraint now, or they're a force of the executive. So practically, I think that that's very much, we see that. I kind of wonder, how did that come about? Because obviously there are laws against, or that kind of are meant to constrain police, but they obviously never get enforced. So are the constraints of the police both built into the law, or are they built into the relationship between police and the legal system? Because it's always interesting how police will rarely ever make it out of the grand jury phase when they're brought to trial. So I wonder if you can maybe expand a little bit on maybe the history of how it came to be that the police became this outside force, and is it because that the systems themselves need that kind of outside the law force? So
Sure. Yeah. Good question. I mean, that's hard to answer. I mean, I'm not a historian. Why I was setting up part of my comments by talking about that older notion of police power, that broader understanding of police power as this broad social policy, right? That wasn't necessarily the police, was really retained. It was really a feudal form of power that kind of was retained with kind of the collapse of feudalism and the rise of capital. And so the point is, I think the question becomes we have to recognize policing as part of the state. And I keep going back to this meaning we need to make distinctions, I guess, between law and the state and not necessarily collapse them, right? together. I think this kind of this is important. I keep going back to this quote by Nikos Poulantzas in State Power Socialism, where he talks about the state always overflows the banks of law. That's his quote, right? Meaning, in the final instance, there's always this, and that's why I was referencing prerogative, right? Because even if you look at John Locke, this foundational liberal thinker, right? Of the social contract and property relations. He has that chapter on prerogative, right? Where it's kind of, and he's not talking about necessarily just police, or police at all, but the idea is that there's a distinction between kind of state necessity and the law, and so my answer to the question would be, for me, that it's built into kind of the history of the state itself, right? Not just the law, or I don't know, does that follow, or does that make sense on some level? That if we link policing more to the state and not law, then this idea of prerogative power makes sense, because the state tends to always overflow the banks of law, and when push comes to shove, this is we can think of this in terms of all one way of putting this is security is the key concept of policing, right? Marx says this too, right? Security is the supreme concept of bourgeois society. And then he says the idea of police. Security is the idea of police, right? And that when you have, so you could get into all these discussions about, say, the typical, civil liberties scenario where we say, who wins out between security and liberty, and how does that work out? And what I would say, this is, it's not an endorsement, but what we know is that security tends to win out. I always explain this to my undergrads. It's like they get in a boxing match, and it's like who you putting your money on, right? When they go head to head in terms of actually existing conditions today, right? Or but the other thing that I would say is this, and this may be a more concrete way of answering it, which is law tends to follow the police. And not the other way around. So, you could get at this through one, concrete example, legal scholar. But look at the Terry stop, Terry versus Ohio, 1968. That sets up the whole stop and frisk later on. Right? It's the foundational legal case. But it wasn't like stops and frisks weren't happening before that case was adjudicated, right? Meaning it was already police practice to stop people however the hell they wanted to stop people. Then, of course, it eventually gets pushed up through the court system, right? And then it's adjudicated on the Supreme Court, and then we have, Terry versus Ohio, right? You see what I'm saying? So it's like, in that case, what happens is police practice was essential, and we know this, I think, in general. I'm not saying there's not exceptions to this, but in general, what we see is law follows police practice, and then law steps in to kind of legitimate already existing police practice, right? So police are doing something, stopping and frisking. It pisses people off. They take it to the courts. It eventually makes its way up. The courts come in and do their ruling. And even though the courts might, on some level, restrain police, they ultimately always allow for a back door, which is the but or the except. Like, you can't do this except in this situation, which leads then to this question about discretion. Well, then who gets to decide that situation? If it was, right, you follow, right? Like, that's kind of the way I think about this, right? So, I wish I could get out of this, but it just keeps leading me back to this one view of arrogant autonomy and police power, that it's a structural relationship, right? Baldwin, when he used that phrase arrogant autonomy, to my knowledge, a lot of people don't pick that up in his to be honest, I read that multiple times and never picked up on that phrase. And then when I finally picked it up, it just struck me as, that makes a lot of sense. I don't think he was necessarily meaning it in the structural sense of the law. Maybe he was, but I think that arrogant autonomy very well describes that structural relationship between police and the law and the state that I'm trying to get at, right? One other example on this, I guess, would be, we can't conflate police with justice. You think of laws related to justice or the courts related to justice, the court as the system in which we adjudicate, we have this, this process where people fight it out for the truth, and then we arrive at some justice. I mean, we know that this doesn't work a lot of the times, but, the principle behind it. But one way to think about this in terms of police violence and what we're talking about, arrogant autonomy, is, the police have the right to do whatever they see fit within any given circumstances because of that discretionary power that they have. The courts might come in later and say, you're wrong, right? But it doesn't take away from the fact that the law itself, because it refuses to find discretion, already gave the cop the license to act however he or she sees fit in that given moment. So right, you can see where I'm getting at here, right? The officer can shoot someone, kill the person. The courts might jump in and, arbitrate this, but it doesn't do anything about the fact that the police still have the prerogative power to decide whose lives matter and whose lives don't matter in that given circumstance.
I was going to say, so one reason why I find this all fascinating is I have a lot of conservative friends. So a lot of the stuff you say, and one of them happens to be a police officer. So I get the privilege of seeing all this pro-police stuff. But, when you talk about killing, and discretion, one of the things that always just boggled my mind was the concept of if a police feared for their life, that they can kill someone. And I remember one day watching this video of this guy that was just watering plants, and a cop kept saying, "Put that down. I'm afraid for my life." And it was water bucket. And I was like, what is he doing? Why would he say he's afraid for his life? He's the one that has a gun pointing it at this guy. Yeah. But it's this idea of discretion, and the law basically maybe it is, but to me, this is how I understand it, where the law basically gives the cop full credence to just do whatever he wants, as long as he just says those magical words. And we'll get into technology where if he says it while wearing that lapel camera, that's almost a free pass. There's plenty of other stuff with stop and frisk, brake lights, right, is basically another way of just saying, hey, your brake light wasn't working. It doesn't matter if it was or wasn't. They just use that as an excuse, and then the law essentially allows them to do what they want, more or less.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if those are examples, but that kind of is how I process.
No, I think they're great examples. And, you brought up brake lights, and I was gonna mention this because it was, a DSA event. A lot of DSA chapters have done the brake light change. And let me be very clear here. I think that's a great program. I think, primarily, and I don't think I'm the only, I think I've read some stuff a few years ago on this, people kind of coming up with a similar, I think it's great for political education, for building community and solidarity and things like that. But I always thought of this when I first read about DSA chapters doing this brake light thing. I actually, of course, I am kind of a one-trick pony, where I'm really hell bent on this arrogant autonomy and prerogative power. And one reason I'll say really quick is because I do think part of my question about what is police is I like asking people what is police, and you would be surprised that a lot of people that you would think would even know better start to stumble if they really are having to think about what is police. You have certain kind of catchphrases, right? Instrument of the ruling class, or even crime fighters, or but thinking about what is police, I think, is a really important question that is more complex. And so to get back to the DSA brake light campaign, one level, it's great for, like I said, political education, building solidarity, things like that. But, the idea that you put in someone else's brake light, which is great, right? I endorse that. I want to be very clear. That's great. But then they're going to drive off the lot safer from police presence. It doesn't, it doesn't totally add up, right? Because what I'm getting at is literally the police can say, oh, he swerved. Did you see that? Right?
Yeah.
So you could, just imagine a guy coming in, getting his brake light fixed and then, driving off, and then all of a sudden a cop doing, and like, oh, wait, he didn't turn signal. And it doesn't matter. That's the thing. It doesn't matter that he did or did not turn signal. What matters is that the law gives the police another great phrase that I love, that I use a lot in my work with autonomy too, is my buddy. I quoted him I cited him in the paper. Mark Nicholas wrote a fabulous book 20 some years ago on police. It's coming out soon, a repub with Verso. But he has the phrase, the permissive structure of law. The permissive structure of law, right? I love that, right? It's permissive. There's law, but it's a permissive structure. And so years ago, I did a ride along with a cop in, a southern city, and we were late at night, and he decides to, start following someone, and I just made him articulate why, and he couldn't really articulate it other than saying, I've done this for so long. After a while, you just get a hunch. You just know, right? And the point is, we could argue about probable cause and reasonable suspicion, and did he meet that and all of that, but there was no one there to arbitrate that at the time. And damn good and well what he's doing when he does write the report later. He's going to say he's going to try to. So that's that permissive structure of law that allows the police to do that. And your point also, Michael, about the garden, out in the garden, and the magic words, as you keep saying, I frightened for my life, right? I mean, there's a legal case about that, Graham versus Connor, right? I think it's in the late 80s, which it would be interesting to see if that could ever be challenged. It would be interesting to see how that might change what I'm saying is the prerogative power. But we have another word for this, right? It's furtive movements. We have an entry on it in the Police a Field Guide book, but furtive movements, and it really does point to just the simple fact that it's police that determine what's a furtive movement. And we know this. We have years and years and years and years of evidence and examples and case studies that anything can literally be deemed a furtive movement. Because at the end of the day, it boils down to whose word is going to win out. Who has the authority of the state behind them, and so anyway.
Yeah, you can't Monday morning quarterback it, as they like to say a lot, right? Unless you're there and know everything about the situation, you can't question whether that was the right decision. This is stuff I hear when I'm like, don't you think it was weird that the cop just shot that person randomly?
Yeah. I would just quickly add to that. You just got me thinking. I made a comment in the little talk that I gave about, police discretion. The courts refused to define police discretion, right? Because to define it would be to limit it.
Yeah.
But that essentially also applies to police itself. Meaning, courts have been very they won't necessarily always define what the police project is. And why I thought of this when your comment, when you making those comments, Michael, was, one way I always describe this is, it's not like police officers get, or the law allows or encourages police officers to get like a checklist of things they can do when they enter a room. Because that itself would be defining what police have at their disposal. You see what I'm saying? Like, that's the fundamentally inherent violent nature of policing within that arrogant autonomy, permissive structure, the law formulation I'm talking about. They don't say, hey, you're going to go in there, those group of students, and you can't use your gun. They don't say that. They can't. And the courts have admitted this. Because why? Because you don't know what's going to happen. The police always have to have at their disposal coercive force. And they have to have essentially unlimited discretionary power in that moment to decide what they think is reasonable.
Yeah.
Right? So even there, it's not just discretion's unlimited, it's police itself is not ever really given any real parameters about what they can do in a situation. So we think it's excessive. We might be morally disgusted. But from the perspective of the law and police and the state.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe, I don't know if this is connected, but, you know, the idea that the police, and when I heard about this like a year ago, and I was shocked. The police legally don't have a requirement to protect people. And which in my mind, just making this connection, is that they then usually, and this is how they think, their first responsibility is to protect themselves, which is kind of the opposite of the, you know, propaganda that they, you know, talk about how they're there to protect and serve. Well, if you're there to protect and serve, and theoretically you're innocent until proven guilty, you would think that that would force cops to maybe put themselves in a more sacrificial role when dealing with people. Because, you know, if your first duty was to make sure that everyone was safe, you know, then you wouldn't necessarily have the freedom to just shoot someone or do whatever. And I'm not sure those are connected, but like, to me, that kind of pops into mind, that kind of situation.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think you do bring up a good point that a lot of people need to hear. You know, I mean, it is true. You know, the police are not necessarily legally obligated to like protect individual lives.
Yeah.
You know, they don't have to run into the barricaded building, right? We know that. We see that all the time. I mean, in fact, what they would say is, hell no, you know, like we got to form our perimeter. We got to take care of ourselves first and all of that. Yeah, it's to protect the larger abstract order. You know, that's yeah, I mean, that's an important point that we don't get. I mean, I think this gets also at the issue of policing itself. That there's just all kinds of myths, and again, I go back to this, why we have to really think about what is police and really rigorously work on that question in our own everyday praxis and thinking, is because because policing is one of those things that I think is so normalized historically, as if we, like I already said, like you say that to people and they're like, oh yeah, you study police. I already know police, you know, like we already know what it's about. But it's like, no, if you really start getting into the nitty gritty of things, it becomes more complicated, right? And you have to constantly fight about myths, you know, the protect and serve, or, you know, it's a dangerous job. You know, I mean, it's like, yes, it can be dangerous, but we know that, you know, there was a meme going around a few months ago, right? I don't know if this is particularly accurate, but it gets at the sentiment, you know, that pizza delivery drivers are at more risk than police officers, you know,
I think I've held two or three jobs that are technically statistically more dangerous than police officers, as a construction worker, Uber driver, and delivery person.
Yeah. And, you know, I think also one other thing, and then maybe we can move on if you want, or I have other questions. But on this issue of arrogant autonomy, another way that I think in terms of on the violence component of that is this, which is, there's no such thing, and I'm using this from another guy that writes. He wrote an article on, Evan Calder Williams wrote an article on police and comedy. But I love the way he frames this, which is, there's no equal exchange between a cop and a non-cop. I mean, you know, this is the way that there is. I mean, you know, it's kind of appropriate to speak of the tyranny of police in these kind of situations, which is, there is no equal exchange between a cop and a non-cop. Like, the law recognizes no real instance when you have a known cop in relationship to his or her subject to allow for resistance or pushback.
Yeah.
Right? You can argue, but that's up to the discretion of the police of when they're going to decide when that has all of a sudden crossed the line. But the point is, it's always an authoritarian relationship, even when it might look non-authoritarian, right? And this is, again, a structural thing about the way the police fits within the larger legal and state apparatus, right? There's just no equal exchange. It's always, a hierarchy that means it dictates all social relationships that police are involved in. And we know this, implicitly, we know this, right? I mean, that's why police show up to the football game when nothing's going on that they need to be there for, right? There's a constant kind of assertion of authority and hierarchy as if they're the last arbiters or the last line of defense from anarchy or chaos or whatnot.
So there's so much to cover, and we're coming up on 8:00, so I want to really open it up. But first, I kind of want to we're going to have kind of a long, maybe commentary question, and I think it's going to talk about some of this stuff. To start, the idea that cops are not equal is always something that, I mean, I think it's so true, right? If someone pushes me and punches me, I can punch back. But if you do that with a cop who's, illegally arresting you, that's resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer.
Sure. Yeah.
And so some things I want to kind of touch on, and again, there's going to be a little bit long, so forgive me.
No.
Is the idea you're talking about is the police as like an executive force of the state and overflowing law and protecting order, and that I think during the protest that becomes blatantly clear when the cops are violating freedom of press, when they're violently attacking peaceful protesters, so both First Amendment things. We catch them pushing people to the ground, causing brain injuries, tear gas, a whole list of things. And it's allowable despite probably being, it may not be illegal, but it's certainly violence because it's in protection of order. And you even see this amongst conservatives where they're more concerned about burning down a Wendy's than they are about all the violations of the First Amendment.
Yeah.
And I think that this comes to the idea of, the thin blue line. And I wish we could spend more time on language because there's a fantastic section of the book, and I really recommend people pick up the book. It's an easy read, but it's really thought-provoking. About how that concept is a battle concept. It's a war concept. And, my own commentary being that you have the police, you have the good people, society, order, justice, like you were describing in the beginning. You have the police that are there to protect against anarchy, and then you have all the bad people. And we didn't get to go into your article about zombification or Walking Dead, but that's another fascinating article, is about how people that are opposed or on the other side of that thin blue line that are, facing off against cops all of a sudden become bad, evil in respect because the cops hold a moral hierarchy, at least in the discourse. And, I think that's interesting because then it allows any kind of violence that is directed at those people, whether it's protesters, sex workers, African Americans, so on, to be justified. And then they post facto try to justify it constantly. The disgusting stuff I heard about George Floyd afterwards about his rep sheet, like that mattered at that moment. And I think that the way that the language plays is important. I think I'll stop on that because I do want to have a question about state and the legitimate use of force before we open it, but I'll let you kind of comment on that.
No, I guess let me just comment on the thin blue line. I think thin blue line, one, it's not a new thing. A lot of commentators, if you research this online, will date it to the 1950s with William, the racist police chief in LA, William Parker. But it actually goes back at least to the 1870s. So, and I say that because I think it's important. I think a lot of times when we talk about police, we tend to date things, as if everything started in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, like it was that period. And of course, that had a huge impact on the current moment. But there's something about policing that's the police institution has always imagined itself to be at war, and to like, this is not necessarily a new thing, you know, and also what if you take the thin blue line seriously, and I think we have to in terms of I get this, you know, this thing that I like thinking about, or you know that you know when police say they're waging war, then we don't need to see that as just rhetoric. Like that's maybe take that seriously when they say that they're hunters of men. Something else I'm writing on for my current book. You know that the police often talk of themselves as hunters of men. Then we should probably take them seriously at that. Like that's maybe how they start to actually see their world in some ways, right? And so I think you got to do that with a thin blue line. What I would say about the thin blue line is it's not just that police, according to them, are the dividing line between civilization and savagery. It's that they're the line itself, meaning like they are the first and the last line that separates order from disorder. And I've written another article that came out recently where I expand and I look more at the history of the thin blue line, but I talk about it as the police invention of humanity. Meaning, like if you take police at their word, they actually think that there's no such thing. If you take the thin blue line seriously, that there's literally no such thing as life itself. And really what they're talking about, right, is basically capitalist life, right? Of private property and accumulation and the wage, the commodity form, all of that, that it doesn't even exist, or it can exist without police first. And this also, I think, highlights that inextricable kind of link between police and capital. You know, that capital does, in fact, rely on police to enforce its property relations. And so it's a seductive discourse for a lot of people. And of course, it's really trying to say then that the idea of having no police is absolutely absurd and insane. And not only that, kind of a violent, we get back to Hobbes and life's brutish short, brutish and short, right? If there is no, police power essentially in place to kind of protect humanity from animality, right? And of course we know that there's all kinds of, that's just like, it just doesn't make sense in many ways, all right? Like one, policing is a relatively new historical formation. There's, entire societies without police. And we know there's all kinds of communities that don't actually have police. They tend to be the ones with more resources and all of that. And that in itself is a problematic thing to kind of think through. But yeah, I do think language and mythology is important to the police. I keep thinking of a few years ago, I think during Black Lives Matter, the first upsurge with, I think it was the New York NYPD went on strike and they're like, we're not gonna, and the assumption was like, civilizational collapse, and then it was like, actually, guess what? Not much happened.
Didn't crime actually go down or something like that?
It actually went down. Yeah, and that's one of those other myths, right? That's like a practical thing. It's not a theoretical thing or a conceptual thing. We know that policing, like we have study after study after study for decades now. Police have very little real impact on crime rates. We know that, and yet, that idea still persists. Now, I mean, I think that leads us to the current moment, which is maybe something we should talk about at some point, which is, the police legitimacy crisis today seems to be unlike no other. Yeah. 4 months ago, if you told me that there was going to be this much critique of police, where I think it was the poll that said 54% of people felt that the burning down of the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis was justified, I would have told you were nuts, And now all of a sudden it's like, it's really on the question of like, people are really confronting this. It's not just about the police, right? It's about a larger capitalist system. But what I'm saying is policing isn't a sideshow to that, right? It's kind of fundamental to that system.
Yeah, historically, it was almost always police or some police adjacent groups that would beat up union workers, going back for however long. Yeah. So I don't know. I kind of want to get this last question off, and then we'll go to group questions. So, Cole, I don't know.
Michael, before you ask that, I'm going to open the chat now. So if people want to throw in questions while this last question is unraveling, and then once you finish that, we can move straight into people's questions.
Perfect. Yeah. So, going on like kind of that more theoretical, there's a great line in your book where you quote Max Weber saying that the state is the institution that claims monopoly over the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. And, if the police are basically the one institution or the main institution of force by the state, I guess my question is, do you think that is that Max Weber's formulation is correct of like what the state is? And then if it is, how do we deal with, I guess maybe justified applications of force? Like, I think there's always that issue of sometimes, there is something where you just need to force someone to do something. If like a company, I know this doesn't happen a lot, but if a company is polluting a river and they don't want to do anything about it, maybe you do need to drag them into court. Even if you're not throwing them in prison, you're fining them.
Yeah.
So, I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess on one level, my thoughts are, damn, that's, I was going to answer your last question in a short way, so we could get to the other comments. I don't know. I think I don't know is a good answer on questions that you really don't know. Of course I have thoughts on it. I can recognize some obviously use of the state. But I think, so long as we're in this capitalist formation and policing is integral to it, I think that we do need to, we can separate out, I guess, the state as this broader apparatus that has all kinds of multiple, functions and apparatuses, and we can identify as problematic certain apparatuses. You know what I mean, right? Like that's more, and so there is something about policing that's important. I would just say this. I don't know if this is going to get at your answer, Michael, but you did kind of bring up abolition within it. But I would just note, that abolition, and Angela Davis has made this point, and all kinds of other, the kind of the real thinkers behind abolition, a lot of Black women, that are amazing. They really stress the fact that abolition isn't just about a negative project of tearing things down. It's about building things up. And meaning it's about building the institutions and the communities and the social relations that we actually want to live in and be a part of. And that might seem like a cop-out to the question, but I think it's right. Like we can make hypotheticals about all of these situations, and they are real situations. Like, no one's saying that, police abolition is going to lead necessarily to like no crime or no, no transgressions that are harmful. They're actually harmful to everyday working people. But it is about stressing the fact that it's not just a negative project of just tearing something down. It's about putting in place better, so yes, so Medicare for all, that's something that's a more productive type of institution than simply relying on, coercive force in order to get what you want, right? Or to compel people, what this to do. But I do think that, there is this issue of, about, Weber and that conception of police. And I would just highlight, I guess, that part of the key there that often doesn't get talked about with his is that it's a claim. And I think this is relevant for today, or to the current moment. It's a claim to legitimate violence, right? Meaning, what's legitimate is going to be determined public opinion and in the streets and all of that, right? And there is a difference between, right, legal legitimacy and moral legitimacy, where this is all being kind of articulated now in the current moment, right? That's what's so amazing. That's why I said in my talk a few times, just the phrase legitimacy crisis, because now policing has a legitimacy crisis that I don't know if they've ever, as an institution, have really went through. And they've been in enormous amounts of crisis. Legitimacy is kind of key to they're constantly doing this image work and doing all kinds of reforms in order to gain legitimacy. But now I do think what's going on is that there's not, as my friend Jared Shanahan said recently in an interview he did, all the recuperation strategies that police have seemed to historically do and that seem to have worked seem to not be working as well today. Like, it seems like people are calling BS on it a lot more than they have. And I don't know, I'd like to say I'm optimistic, but I am going to be interested to see how police kind of recuperate their image and their power, in the current moment or in the near future. But yeah.
Yeah. And Cole, just before you give out the question, I just want to say a little bit about what you just said, because I think some stuff is very important to emphasize. And when you talked about a positive project, we had Alex Vitale come last summer and give our group a talk. And I was one of those people that was fairly skeptical about police abolition. And the way he describes it, as it's almost like it's a negative process of stripping away as many injustices as you can. And then maybe if there's something left over, then we'll figure out how to handle that in some way. But, I want to stress this. We as socialists believe in a very positive transformation of society, and that not all, but a lot of social ills and problems come from the way we organize society. Like the part of, like you were describing, police, a lot of it's just enforcing property laws. If you change the property laws, that changes dramatically. And that applies to drugs, right? How much of policing would disappear if we just legalized drugs? How much of policing would disappear if we decriminalize sex work? And you can go down and, if you fix these problems, the need for people to enforce an unjust system begins to evaporate real quick. And maybe you'll have something afterwards. But we believe, and we've stressed this with our work and stuff like housing, that we want to have a positive project associated with defunding or abolition of the police, because it doesn't necessarily do us good, though it is, completely, if we just say, okay, we'll defund the police, but we'll keep all the other structures, that those have to come with it. Because otherwise, people will eventually become reactionary if they see a bunch of homeless people. Unfortunately, just there's a negative reaction, and then the police will creep back up. So, Cole, with questions.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions in the chat. There are a few that kind of touch on the message or on the thought of police abolition and like what kind of comes next after this, because your talk laid out a very clear, a very well articulated and reasoned, but a very like grim picture of the police as an institution. And so I think many people, not just on this talk, but across the country, are in a place where like, I acknowledge and agree that the police are like a rotten institution, but what does the next step kind of look like? And so I guess kind of just consolidating those questions, any general thoughts you had on what it might look like to defund or abolish, even though I know up top you said that's not incredibly your specialty, but so like what might that next step look like? And then kind of branching off of that, what do you think is a good way to talk to people who are not very familiar with abolition, to present it in a way of like, well, we're not just tearing this down and chaos and anarchy are going to rule, but it's a legitimate thing, kind of like Michael said, a positive project.
Yeah. Well, on the first part of that, I don't know if this really gets at the question, but about next step. I do think defunding is it seems to me more of a strategy to work towards abolition, right? As opposed to just the goal itself, right? Because again, and you can see in defunding that positive aspect, right? The idea of taking resources and this and that. And, there's concerns right now amongst the abolitionist community about, social workers are also very much part of kind of the state that, that we can't let go without much critique. Like we need to critique that too. So it's not just a matter of like taking money and giving it to social workers that then are gonna, without changing those larger kind of social relations, economic and property relations. But I would also say this, and I don't know if it gets at your answer, Cole, but what I think maybe is the strength of my analysis, or I guess what I'm trying to push us to think about, is if you take the view of the arrogant autonomy of police seriously, it should then help us better formulate what types of reforms are worth fighting for. That's why defunding makes sense in so many ways, right? Because it's going at the heart of their power, which is the economic power of city budgets and all of that, right? But so, for instance, there's still calls for police community, civilian review boards, but it's like we have an enormous amount of history on that. And so my point is like, that shouldn't be our next step, in my view, right? Like that shouldn't be, or body cameras, right? Body cameras give money to the police. They don't actually take money away from the police. They give money to the police. And so I would say next step, at least if you're thinking about it in terms that I've tried to outline today, or this evening, is that our next steps need to be what the abolitionists call non-reformist reforms, right? Reforms that don't extend the life or the capacity or the reach of the carceral state or, the police power or whatnot. That, reformist reforms are those typical reforms that we keep getting: more education, more training, more technology, however great they look on the surface. And so, and I think, and why I say that, maybe, I don't think it's just avoiding, or I think it's addressing the question, but is that we're in this moment where we're in this really unprecedented moment where abolition, here we are talking about it out in the open. It's in the New York Times. It's everywhere. And that comes with its own risk, right? Of what does it mean? How do we how do we identify the problem, the next steps that we're doing, right? And so I think we need to think about next steps that are really trying to diminish the capacity of police, so that we can maybe focus on, that's what I was trying to say at the opening part. Like, we always run into police. It's like, think of the Jim Crow era. How can you even think of the last fight, the last several years or the last decade of the civil rights movement without thinking of police? It's like police was fundamental to holding that order together, right? So you couldn't build that more positive project out of that without having to kind of come to terms with police. And of course, police did remain. They morphed, they changed their image, they reformed in that moment. And that speaks to kind of the amazing ability of police to kind of constantly recuperate itself. We have Bull Connor, May 1963, releasing dogs on people, and yet somehow now police dogs are like a staple, right? That doesn't happen without much political work going into it.
Okay, so I think kind of building off that, we had another person, I'll just use their first name, Michael, and one of the participants. So I'm going to read what he said, because I think it kind of applies to the civil rights era. He talks about Marxist analysis about special bodies of armed men, of course, applies to police as well as armies, but in settler colonial contexts where settlers broadly participated in conquest, enforcement of slavery, etc., where do police fit in? How do we challenge the cops in our head, particularly among white people? And I think that maybe you can answer that, but also, like, what is the way in which, especially in a divided society, whether that be racial or class, in both, do non do like civilians participate in the role of policing in society?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're, they're crucial, right? I mean, they're, the idea of like deputization or deputizing citizens, right? You have scholars talking about this during, slavery, where, in the U.S., where all white citizens were on one level kind of deputized to be police, right? That they kind of had a certain kind of police power. And so I think there's a long history of this, and definitely the settler colonial context, you see that, where settlers themselves, had an enormous amount of kind of what we might conceive of as a police power, at least in terms of kind of an arbitrary, kind of unlimited power to do whatever they wanted to the native. And then, of course, you see that playing out today. I mean, I think gets us to the current kind of conjuncture in a certain sense, which is, it's not, of course, militias and right-wing groups have been around for a long time, but there is definitely a resurgence of them. And you're seeing them now working with the police. You're seeing all this information coming out about how many of these members of these right-wing groups are part of the police, as actual police officers. And so, I think I think the larger question, as I read it too, from Michael's comment, is, we have to take into account the history of like the U.S. is a settler colonial country. And that means we can't think about policing in the United States without thinking about it coming out of that settler colonial enslaved context, right? It doesn't always mean there's always a direct straight line, but it means there are overlaps. There is a historical kind of inertia and the same kind of or similar kinds of mythologies, patterns, practices still get kind of recoded into the police power in really important ways. And so I think it's absolutely central. And that last question he asked about how do we challenge the cops in our heads, particularly among white people? One level, that's the $64 million question. I don't know. I think, through praxis, through on the ground, kind of trying to build solidarities. And I do think political education, that's why I led with the Rachel Herzing little bit, because I really like her article, Political Education, A Time of Rebellion, to really think about political education as this important. And it doesn't always mean then political education has to be amongst people that already kind of generally, get along. But it means, you can also try to win ground by changing. And I think we're seeing that play out on some level. It's not like, clearly the pandemic has played a serious role in the uprisings, there's a conflation of the murder of George Floyd and the pandemic, and of course Trump and all of these things that did it. But there's been a lot of work of trying to change consciousness on some level to get people in the streets. And I think that's what you're really, I was talking to a friend today, if you think about ACAB, all cops are bastards, that phrase is largely coming, it's actually older than the 70s punk scene. It goes back to England, right? All coppers are bastards. And then even probably before the 1920s. There's this great article that came out recently on Vice, actually, of all places, that has this history of it. But what's interesting about this moment, I was talking to my friend Andrea about this today. If you think of FTP as this phrase that comes out of the hip hop movement, right? And, 1988, NWA, Fuck the Police, the song, and then, 1992, Rodney King riots, it becomes this kind of anthem. And now it's, tagged on every, in every city of the world almost, right? But there's something, what I think, and maybe I'm wrong on this, I don't know, but in the current moment, what we've seen is ACAB and FTP as really kind of now like joined as this aesthetic thing in the streets. And I think it speaks something about like the larger kind of multiracial struggle that's that seems to be forming, that really is coming out now, right? I don't know if that means anything. I mean, I'm sure you could challenge it empirically by going back and showing that there's been all kinds of protests in the past, because we know that, but there's something there that's interesting, I think, to think about, right? That these two kind of, there's something going on with a severe legitimacy crisis of police that is increasingly white people are starting to get on board with. And I mean, you can see this too, right? Economically, right? We know, depressed wages, and there are, white rates of imprisonment are increasing and things like that.
So kind of continuing on with this topic of race, and you touched on the racial roots of the police as well, we have a question of how have you grappled, and as a disclaimer, this is coming off as out of curiosity, not as a confrontation. How have you kind of grappled with the fact that you are a white man speaking on a system of power built to oppress Black people and people of color, mainly by white cops? And sort of what are your thoughts on that dynamic? And she also asked, do you uplift Black voices doing this work as well? And notice that people probably listen to you much more because of the color of your skin. So do you have any thoughts on kind of like your place within this broader context and this broader moment, I suppose?
Yeah. I mean, I'm always trying to uplift other voices. I mean, that was, that's why I tried to lead with Rachel Herzing, who I'm friends with, and I've learned a lot from, and she's, so yeah. But I also think, we know that policing is as a structure, as an institution. That's why I was citing Baldwin specifically too, to get it kind of the anti-Black kind of focus of policing. But I also think it's important to think about policing as this, it affects all kinds of populations, not always equally. But there is, policing is a violent institution. And that means it deals with threats. And we know that threat is largely racialized. But threat also it's a very, kind of amorphous, it's a very broad term that police, do. So we know that all kinds of people from different backgrounds get killed by police and are impacted by police. I teach this in my classes. I teach this article from, it's probably over 20 some years ago, by the African-American legal scholar, Catherine Russell, called "What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue?" And it's like police violence in the Black community or something. But one of the things she points out, right, is that we know policing impacts and kills a lot of white people. And yet why that's important to point out in this, she was writing about this, like I said, 20 some years ago, is that one way white society has often disregarded questions about police brutality and police violence is making it predominantly just a, quote, Black issue, right? She makes it, right? And I'm not, that's not to say we need that's not to not embrace a Black Lives Matter perspective, of course, right? But it means we got to make connections between all different facets of state violence, right? And I think that's what's also happening in this current moment. Is I think something is shifted and happened that is interesting. That's changing the playing field on some level, and changing our relationship to the police. And meaning a variety of different kind of demographics are starting to now think about the police, differently, right? And yeah, I do think obviously my own identity clearly, you see this. I'm a university professor, right? So I see this at the, there's all kinds of research on showing like teaching evaluations, right? We know, that I can, white men tend to be able to get higher evaluations in relationship to Black women, right? And so, you try to be cognizant of that. And yet at the same time, it's like, I have to teach a class. And so I try to push the best arguments that I can in order to do the I guess, the least amount of damage or the most amount of damage to the status quo as I can possibly do, you know? So, yeah.
Definitely. I think we have time for one more question. Someone asks, what are your thoughts about deputies, as some of the worst police abuses are committed informally by off-duty officers? Do you have any thoughts on deputies?
I mean, I don't know if I do. I mean, I don't know much. I mean, I know that happens a lot. I mean, I think you could, just off the cuff, you could say things like, obviously that raises questions about, even if you're off duty, do you still, do you cease becoming a cop? It says something about maybe police culture, that arrogant autonomy of policing is blurring the boundaries between the public and the private, the personal and the political, or your career and job and your own life. But yeah, I mean, you can watch online. I've watched some of them, right? The videos of, an off-duty cop acting like they're on duty. And they still and that speaks, I guess, to the larger power of policing is, having that certain kind of power to intervene even when you're officially not on the clock. But I don't know if that gets at the question or what they were meaning by deputies, but.
Yeah, I think that works. And with that, we're just about at 8:30. Before we wrap up, Tyler, do you have any last words or anything you'd like to throw in before we close out?
Well, no, I don't think so. It's been fun. Hopefully it's been worthwhile on some level. If anybody has any questions for me, they can find me online. I won't say my email on here, but you can find me online and at my university and send me an email, and we can I can try to do my best to answer it there. But I very much thanks for the invitation, and thank everyone for showing up. It's been fun.
Yeah, thank you for coming, and everyone, please buy his book, Police: A Field Guide. It is really good.
Also, keep an eye out for his upcoming book, The Nature of Police.
Actually, that's changed. The title now is Violent Order: Essays on the Nature of Police. It's an edited book, but I think that's with Haymarket. That should come out in spring, I believe. Spring. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Tyler.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. Thank you for speaking. Thank you all for coming tonight. And next week, we have Professor Luis Fernandez, who is going to be talking about the different arguments on police reform, defunding, and abolition. So we'll go more into detail with those topics as well. Tuesday, 7 o'clock, we hope to see you there as well. Thank you all for coming and enjoy your night.
Thank you, everyone.